In this segment, we are going to explore America's role in the First World War and our entry into great power politics. We will begin by looking at the U.S. relationship with Mexico during its 1910 revolution and how that reveals what we will call President Wilson's missionary diplomacy. It will also ironically set the stage for the United States declaration of war in 1917. It's natural to associate this period with the iconic images of trench warfare and the harrowing experiences of soldiers on the Western Front in Europe. However, to fully understand the United States' involvement in this era, we must turn our attention to a different aspect of foreign policy, specifically the situation in Mexico. This shift in focus allows us to build on our previous discussions on foreign policy, populism, and progressivism, highlighting a significant domestic political development: the splintering of the Republican Party due to progressivism. This internal division within the Republican Party was initiated by Theodore Roosevelt, a highly popular figure who had firmly aligned himself with progressive ideals. In 1912, disenchanted with President William Howard Taft's lackluster support for progressive reforms, Roosevelt sought to reclaim the presidency. However, his bid for the Republican nomination was unsuccessful, prompting him to run as a candidate for the newly formed Progressive Party, also colloquially known as the Bull Moose Party. This move by Roosevelt ultimately led to the Republican Party's defeat in the 1912 election. The election of 1912 was notable not just for the fragmentation of the Republican Party, but also for the significant ideological shift that occurred within the Democratic Party. Woodrow Wilson, running as a Democrat, embraced a progressive platform, signaling a transformation in the party's stance. This election marked a critical turning point in American political history, where the traditional alignments of the parties on social issues began to shift. Prior to 1912, the Republican Party was predominantly viewed as the liberal party, especially in terms of social policies. However, the aftermath of the 1912 election saw the Democratic Party emerging as the standard-bearer for liberalism. Woodrow Wilson's approach to foreign policy, often termed missionary diplomacy, signifies a distinctive departure from the interventionist strategies employed by previous Republican administrations. Wilson harbored a profound belief in American superiority and the inherent virtue of the American way of life, which he saw as emblematic of manifest destiny. This belief underpinned his conviction that the values and principles guiding the United States were not only universally applicable, but also universally desirable. In the era preceding Wilson's presidency, American foreign policy in Latin America was largely driven by imperialistic ambitions, with interventions frequently justified on the grounds of protecting American business interests. Wilson, however, diverged from this path, positing that while intervention for the sake of business was not in keeping with American ideals, intervention to foster democracy was not only justified but necessary. This philosophy of missionary diplomacy was rooted in the notion that the United States had a moral obligation, or mission, to spread democracy, liberty, and by extension, other components of liberal ideology such as secularism and capitalism. The end goal of Wilson's policy was not merely the export of a political system, but the broader dissemination of a way of life that he deemed superior. Wilson's firm belief in the righteousness of this mission reflects a broader American ethos of the time, emphasizing not just the spread of democracy as a form of governance, but the broader propagation of liberty as a fundamental principle. Wilson's missionary diplomacy represents a nuanced form of interventionism, one that prioritizes ideological and moral imperatives over the economic or strategic interests that had typically motivated earlier interventions. This approach, while still interventionist in nature, highlights a shift in American foreign policy towards a more ideologically driven engagement with the world, specifically in promoting the values of democracy and liberty as universal ideals. As we approach 1910, Mexico finds itself in a curious position. Under the long rule of Porfirio Diaz and the influence of the Científicos, a group of advisors guided by positivism, the nation has achieved a degree of modernization. However, this progress has come at a cost. Diaz has been in power for over 3 decades, his cabinet largely unchanged. This lack of political turnover draws increasing criticism, both domestically and abroad. Further complicating matters is the impending centennial of Mexican independence in 1910. September 16, 1810, marks the Grito de Dolores, a cry for freedom that ignited the struggle against Spanish rule. This momentous occasion presented an opportunity for Mexico to showcase its modernization efforts on the world stage. In anticipation, Mexico City underwent a significant facelift, with grand new architecture reflecting a sense of national pride. However, a key criticism persisted. Mexico's embrace of modernity hasn't extended to democratic reform. Diaz has long maintained that true democracy must wait for Mexico's modernization to be complete. Recognizing the need to address this growing concern, Diaz makes a calculated move in the lead-up to the 1910 centennial. He announces to the world that he will not seek re-election, attempting to portray this as a gesture of good faith and a commitment to eventual democratic transition. Francisco Madero, a wealthy landowner from northern Mexico, with an education from the University of California, Berkeley, emerged as a leading critic of the regime. He capitalized on widespread public yearning for democratic reform by announcing his candidacy for president. Madero's campaign resonated deeply with the Mexican people. The prospect of a genuine democratic election, a concept long suppressed under Diaz, ignited popular enthusiasm. However, as it became increasingly clear that Madero was likely to win a fair election, President Diaz resorted to authoritarian tactics. He ordered Madero's arrest, effectively derailing the electoral process. Undeterred, Madero escaped imprisonment and fled to Texas. From exile, he issued a formal declaration known as a pronunciamiento. This document denounced Diaz's fraudulent election and called for an armed uprising to overthrow the dictatorship. The Plan of San Luis Potosí, as it was later called, marked the official beginning of the Mexican Revolution, a bloody conflict that would engulf the nation for over a decade. The early promise of Madero's presidency was tragically cut short. A counter-revolutionary movement emerged, led by General Victoriano Huerta. Huerta, a ruthless figure who embodied the very antithesis of democratic ideals, sought to restore the authoritarian status quo of the Diaz era. This counter-revolution was fueled in part by the vested interests of foreign powers. As you'll recall from the film Los Mineros, foreign corporations, particularly American mining companies, had acquired significant land holdings and influence in Mexico under Diaz. This foreign investment generated substantial wealth, but the benefits largely flowed out of Mexico, enriching foreign companies while the Mexican people remained impoverished. Unsurprisingly, these foreign investors had a vested interest in maintaining the stability and predictability of the Diaz regime. Consequently, several foreign embassies, including the American Embassy, provided crucial support to Huerta's counter-revolution. This culminated in a 10-day period of violent upheaval known as La Decena Trágica, the 10 Tragic Days. The conflict ended with the deaths of both President Madero and Vice President Pino Suárez, leaving Huerta in control of the Mexican government with the tacit approval of some foreign powers. President Woodrow Wilson's approach to Mexico stood in stark contrast to the actions of the American ambassador. Wilson, a strong advocate for missionary diplomacy, believed in promoting democracy abroad. He viewed Huerta's counter-revolution as a betrayal of democratic principles and a return to the very dictatorship he opposed. Consequently, Wilson recalled the American ambassador and publicly denounced Huerta's regime. This left the revolutionary movement fractured, with two key opposition leaders vying for power, Venustiano Carranza and Pancho Villa. Carranza, the leader of the constitutionalist faction, aligned more closely with Wilson's vision for a democratic Mexico. Recognizing this, Wilson chose to back Carranza in his struggle against Huerta. President Wilson sought to actively support the Mexican Revolution, and an opportunity to intervene soon presented itself in the form of the Tampico affair. In this incident, a small American vessel was detained by Mexican forces in the port of Tampico. The detention of the crew under a ship flying the American flag was perceived as a grave affront to American sovereignty. The United States demanded an apology and a formal 21-gun salute to the American flag from the Mexican garrison at Tampico. Predictably, the Mexicans refused. This provided the pretext Wilson sought, and he ordered American troops to occupy Veracruz, a major port on the Gulf of Mexico. This strategic move targeted the customs house, the source of much of the Mexican government's revenue. By cutting off this critical source of funding, Wilson effectively weakened the Huerta regime, contributing to Carranza's eventual victory. Following his victory over Huerta, Venustiano Carranza established himself as the new president of Mexico. A new constitution was drafted and ratified, attempting to restore stability to the war-torn nation. However, this period of relative peace was shattered by the resurgence of Pancho Villa. Carranza and Villa, once allies against Huerta, became bitter rivals vying for control. While Wilson initially favored Carranza's constitutional government, the relationship between the United States and Mexico remained tense. One key source of friction was the lingering resentment over the American occupation of Veracruz. Carranza demanded U.S. withdrawal, further straining diplomatic relations. In this environment, Wilson continued a limited policy of supporting Villa in the hopes of weakening Carranza. This precarious situation reached a boiling point in 1916 when Pancho Villa launched a daring raid across the border, attacking the American town of Columbus, New Mexico. Incensed by this act of aggression, Wilson ordered a punitive expedition into Mexico, a military operation aimed at capturing Villa. The punitive expedition proved a frustrating endeavor, failing to apprehend Villa and instead escalating tensions with the Mexican government. The growing risk of a full-blown war with Mexico on the eve of World War I forced Wilson to reevaluate his priorities. Recognizing the looming conflict in Europe, Wilson ultimately withdrew the American Expeditionary Force from Mexico. He prioritized American involvement in the global struggle over a protracted military intervention in Mexico. This decision marked a turning point in U.S.-Mexico relations, highlighting the competing interests and complexities that would continue to shape their relationship in the decades to come. Please proceed to answer the questions in the assignment on Canvas. If you have any questions, you can post them in the open forum discussion or contact the professor using Canvas email.